Someone this week asked a question about why the Buddha got up from his seat to teach. This chant at the beginning of the Dhamma talk that Dave recited is the appeal of Brahma Sahampati to the Buddha. When the Buddha was initially awakened, fully awakened, his first inclination was to remain under the Bodhi tree enjoying the bliss of enlightenment. The thought occurred to him, this teaching of mine is deep and subtle, and the beings of this generation are attached to their sense pleasures, and they will not easily listen to the teaching. An attempt to pass on this teaching would only produce weariness and vexation. So his inclination was to stay and enjoy the state of full awakening. And if he had done that, he would have been just a Pacceka Buddha, and we would have no knowledge of him today. He would have passed into obscurity. There would be no historical record of his attainment. It would have had no effect on the world. The Brahma Sahampati intervened, Brahma Sahampati being a very high-level Mahabrahma. There is a reasonably good case to be made that Brahma Sahampati is actually the Mahabrahma of this universe. So the prevailing conception at the Buddha's time of the Brahmanical religion, Mahabrahma would have been the supreme deity, the creator god of the universe. This is how the Indian culture would have perceived this being. Then he came down and manifested before the Buddha, and on bended knee, which is significant in that the Mahabrahma humbled himself before the Buddha. On bended knee, he begged the Buddha, out of compassion, to rise from his seat and teach the Dhamma, because there are those beings in the world with little dust in their eyes, and they are currently perishing for lack of the Dhamma, lack of hearing the teaching. So the Buddha consented to the request of Brahma Sahampati, rose from his seat, and carried on, beginning his career as a teacher that lasted for 45 years. And of course, converted and saved many millions of beings over time, over the centuries. What this episode encapsulates is the interplay of the two supreme attributes of the Buddha, which are wisdom and compassion. And the two can be perceived as being in conflict or in tension. They can seem initially to have an incompatibility. They come together in perfection in the Buddha. There's no more tension between them. Whatever tension is perceived between them initially is a falsity ultimately. It's ultimately an error. The two are not in conflict, although they seem it. They can seem it for a long time. Wisdom in Buddhism means the seeing of things, understanding of things according to reality and not otherwise. This panya, that is wisdom, is one of the spiritual faculties. It's a very important central quality. It's what we develop with Vipassana meditation, is learning to see things in their reality and not otherwise. And this means, in the highest sense, it means seeing the emptiness of all things, seeing voidness, seeing the not-self quality in one's own being, and seeing the emptiness, the sunya of all dhammas, of all phenomena. Compassion is karuna, is the spiritual faculty or quality of wishing that, or aspiring to all beings being freed from their suffering. Karuna is one of the four Brahma Viharas, the dwelling places of the Brahmas, which is not unrelated to the detail that it was the Brahma Sahampati who came and begged the Buddha, being a representative or an agent of the quality of compassion. It's important to understand the nuances of what exactly the state of compassion or karuna means in the Buddhist context. The word compassion in English is a pretty reasonable translation, but there is a caveat. You have to be a bit careful because the word compassion comes from a root meaning to suffer with, compassion, and that is not the meaning of karuna. Karuna is not to be understood as vicarious suffering. This is quite important. If one has the true spiritual quality of karuna and one encounters suffering in other beings, then the karuna arouses an aspiration, may this being not suffer. It doesn't raise up a vicarious suffering. It doesn't induce suffering in the person outside looking on. This is really a touchstone to know whether you are experiencing genuine karuna. If it makes you feel, to contemplate the suffering of other beings makes you feel sad yourself, then it's not pure, it's not a perfect karuna. This vicarious suffering, because if you think about it in a logical way, the whole thrust of Buddhist ethics and practice is to reduce suffering in the world, to reduce suffering in self and others. And if you experience a vicarious suffering, you're just adding to the sum total of suffering in the universe. So you're not helping matters, you're actually making matters worse. Each one of these Brahma Viharas has a near enemy and a far enemy. The far enemy being the mental state that is the opposite, a negative mental state. So in the case of karuna, it's cruelty. That's pretty obvious. Cruelty is a wish to increase suffering in others. So this is a negative state that's the direct opposite. But the near enemy is a mental state that is a counterfeit that can be mistaken for the Brahma Vihara, and in this case is pity. The English word pity, not Pali, piti. This kind of maudlin sentimentality. And this is what I mean by increasing suffering, vicarious suffering. Rousing of compassion, it is a Brahma Vihara, it's a mental state. It doesn't necessitate action in the world. It can be a motivating factor for action to relieve suffering in the world, to do something, but it's not necessarily so. It might remain purely as a mental state, and it's still then karuna. And this is one of the points in which there's an intersection of wisdom and compassion, because when compassion arouses in a being, you see suffering outside of oneself, and there's an aspiration, may this suffering be decreased. Then it takes wisdom to discern, is there anything useful I can do to relieve this suffering? And if there is, then it's meritorious to take an action and relieve the suffering. But if there's not, then you know then that by wisdom that the correct action is inaction, is doing nothing. For someone who has compassion with no wisdom, there's often the urge to meddle, to interfere, to try and fix things. and it often just ends up making matters worse. And you have to have that wisdom of discernment to know when to step back and just take refuge in equanimity. The Brahmavihara of equanimity, upekkha, is defined as recognizing that all beings are subject to their karma and heirs to their karma, that all suffering experienced by beings is ultimately the results of their karma. So wisdom and compassion, I said that they can be perceived as being in tension. Wisdom without compassion can be seen as cold, aloof, kind of a heartless sort of approach to practice and life. So all beings are empty anyway, so who cares? Let it all be. And this is perfectly in accord with wisdom to remain sitting under the Bodhi tree. The Buddha correctly discerned that most beings would not properly hear his teaching, and it would be a vexation and a weariness. But the compassion comes in this case, is aroused from the outside, from Brahma Sahampati, who reminds the Buddha that there are those with little dust in their eyes. It might be that most people will not understand your teaching, or will just it'll go in one ear or out the other, or they'll be resistant to it. But there are those with little dust in their eyes. There are those that it is possible to arouse wisdom and renunciation. So compassion without wisdom is the opposite, is the urge to endlessly be trying to fix things. Compassion without wisdom would, it doesn't really apply in the case of the Buddha, because he had, perfect wisdom under the Bodhi tree, but there's plenty of people that are without wisdom who are trying to fix everybody else's life, running around and trying to meddle and fix and fiddle with everybody else in the whole world, without any guiding wisdom, but their heart just tells them they have to do something. And this is an activity based on compassion, but with no wisdom behind it, that often is counterproductive more often than not, and actually increases the stock of suffering in the world. The coming together of wisdom and compassion is the perfection of a Buddha. There's no tension or dichotomy in the being of a Buddha between the two. The two end up being completely harmonious and essentially the same thing. And we have to try and find in our own practice and our own behavior, our life, our relations with others, a harmonious blending of these qualities of wisdom and compassion. To see things with the eye of wisdom and to maintain a heart of compassion, to guide and judge our actions. It's a difficult balancing act. It's something, one of these points in which we have to seek a balance, a middle path, balance the two poles of being clear and wise with being compassionate and acting from the heart. And these qualities are spoken of quite a lot in Mahayana Buddhism, wisdom and compassion. And symbology in Tibetan Buddhism in particular recognizes 4 kinds of wisdom, or 5 wisdoms. Some Mahayana teachings is 4 wisdoms, and in Tibet they add a 5th, the 5 wisdoms. It's the wisdom of equality, particular wisdom, or the discriminating wisdom, the mirror-like wisdom, the wisdom of tathata, or suchness, and those are the 4, and then they add a 5th as the harmony of the 4, is the wisdom of compassionate action or skillful action, when the 4 wisdoms come together. We have in Tibetan Buddhism these mandalas of deities that are often arranged in 5, and this is very often the underlying symbology of that, is the 5 wisdoms. the wisdom of suchness, tathata. Suchness is a Mahayana concept that means like the underlying fundamental reality, the ground reality of all things, which is essentially empty. And the mirror-like wisdom is the wisdom that overcomes duality, overcomes the subject-object duality as things are reflected in the face of a mirror. The wisdom of equality and the wisdom of discrimination are two very practical aspects of wisdom that apply very much directly to our practice. When we see with the mind, according to reality, we see a Dhamma, an object of consciousness, whether it be a mind state or a physical object. It has different aspects and qualities. And with full wisdom, we see both the universal aspects and the particular aspects. The particular aspects is what we develop, trying to develop precision in noticing objects. We know this object is a thought, this is a mental image, this is a memory, this is an external sound, this is a sensation in the body. So we know like the particular class that the object belongs to, and we can also know in some cases whether this is a skillful object or an unskillful one, whether this is pleasurable or painful, and so on. There's many different ways of classifying. But all Dhammas also have universal aspects, and this is the non-discriminating, or the wisdom of equality, or the wisdom of upekkha, is seeing that all objects are conditioned, all objects are imperfect, all objects are unsatisfying, they're impermanent, and most important and ultimately, they're void, they're empty. And this applies to all conditioned objects without exception. So we need to see both the universal and the particular in each object for a full spectrum of wisdom. In regards to wisdom and compassion, is another kind of evocative teaching from Vajrayana, from Tibetan teaching about wisdom and compassion, is that the quality of wisdom is seen as female and the quality of compassion is seen as male. And they often use this kind of gender or sexual symbolism in their texts and their images. And this is something that bears contemplation, and it's kind of the opposite of superficial, what one might think superficially goes against maybe the dominant sort of cultural narrative. But there's a deep teaching hidden in there that wisdom is female and compassion is male. It's not exactly the same, but it's parallel to another use in Tibetan of the kind of gender-based symbology, is that for full awakening requires the lightning spark, the vajra, or of the dorje, and the bell, the dorje and the bell. This is often you see deities in Tibetan symbolism. With the dorje is a lightning bolt. It's got a very stylized form. You may have seen them. I don't think we've got one down here. There's they often make them. I've got one. They make them out of brass with a kind of a double head, and the bell is like the cup shape of the bell that represents the void, emptiness, and it's also symbolized by the womb, the female womb, which is an empty space that has the potential of creation, but it's void in itself. It's just an empty space. It's a holding place, and it's only activated by the lightning flash. So that all the potential is in the wisdom of the female, but to activate it takes the lightning flash of the Dorje, which is male. So there's the bell and the Dorje the coming together is a symbol in Tibetan Buddhism of full enlightenment. Each one is like part of the picture. So the wisdom is seen as is empty, but it ultimately has the potential of all things. So the full emptiness is a phrase that's sometimes used. It's a universal potentiality. And compassion is the activity. It's the clear flash of lightning in the empty sky. So that wisdom and compassion together is a fulfillment, is a completion, is the perfection of a Buddha. It's a Sammasambuddha, perfectly enlightened by himself. And it's really essentially this quality of compassion that is the added ingredient in the mix between a Pacceka Buddha and a Sammasambuddha. A fully enlightened Buddha has the compassion to try and liberate all beings. A Pacceka Buddha is one who is fully awakened, but he hasn't got the impulse to teach. So his awakening doesn't go really beyond himself. So I think I'll stop there.